Welcome to A Case for America. This is Austin Hepworth. I am here along with Michael Hepworth, and we are here to talk about America, something that we definitely love and enjoy being a part of. I'm an attorney, focus on the law. Michael's a numbers guy, likes to focus on numbers and things associated with that. And we come from the approach when we talk about law that the Constitution and the things that made America the land that it is and have helped us have all that we do have here are that the Constitution helped create a state of liberty, which we define as the balance between anarchy and tyranny. To get out of anarchy, we need laws. To stay away from tyranny, we need morality. And so we are exploring this balance in this series and going through a number of principles, especially associated with the Constitution, to talk about how this balance exists, as well as to evaluate laws and look at where they fall if they're pushing the balance too far to one side or the other. Because we do believe that currently there are some things out of balance and that we as a people need to work to rectify those. Today, going to the Fifth Amendment. Last time we focused some on a few provisions in the Fifth Amendment, but we have the focus this week of the Due Process Clause. Now, due process of law, it's a term that gets thrown out a lot, and to different people, it can mean different things. We are going to approach it from the perspective of saying that due process essentially means you get the process that's due to you by law or that's required by law. And the Constitution is saying a judge just can't willy-nilly pick and choose what they do, how they treat you. They can't just throw you in jail for some unwritten law. Everything has to be according to a procedure that's written. And so due process, its basic concept of saying that everything has to be according to a procedure that's written, means that you can know what to expect if you're in court. If you're interacting with the law or government, it's supposed to be that justice is blind. So you'll see justice there holding the scales sometimes with a blindfold over her eyes, because justice is supposed to be blind. It's supposed to be the same for you, whether you're black or white, whether you're male or female, no matter where you come from, what you look like, the law is supposed to apply to you the same. So at a base level, they have what the courts have kind of broken it into two parts with due process. They have procedural due process, where they say that the Constitution requires that you get notice of the law that you're claimed to have violated, as well as an opportunity to be heard. So notice and an opportunity to be heard are the two hallmarks of procedural due process. And again, this is where the courts have to follow a certain procedure. The government has to follow a procedure. If you get sued, people have to follow a procedure. They have to give you notice. Then you get a chance to go to trial, to have your case heard, to talk about things, present evidence. And all of that ties into different provisions of the Constitution. There are provisions in the Constitution about right to a jury trial, for example, right to be represented by counsel. These are part of the procedures that you're due as part of due process if you're ever accused of violating a law in the United States. Now, due process, though, in addition to this procedural side, it does get a little bit into they call it substantive due process when you read the courts talking about it. There are some aspects of due process that say that we are protected from laws that are inherently unjust or go too far. And so the Supreme Court, in cases in the 1960s, for example, there was a case about whether states could ban the use of contraceptives between married couples. And ultimately, the Supreme Court ruled, no, that's so unfair that couples are being regulated by the government with what they do, that we are going to strike that down and say it violates substantive due process. And substantive due process has been the basis for a variety of rulings and holdings. It was the basis for Roe v. Wade, that upheld the right to abortion, that said it's not fair for the government to regulate something so personal. It was part of the case law on gay marriage associated with that, where it was fundamentally we can't discriminate. Certainly other aspects of the 14th Amendment came into that case as well, but due process was discussed and the substantive nature of inherent unfairness of laws and of individuals' rights to personal decisions. And so when we look at due process and evaluate it, we have to understand that when the courts look at what processes do to you, what rights do they have to respect if they're going to take you through this process and put you in jail or hold you liable for something? They are also looking at whether something's fair or not. And if it's too unfair, in their opinion, they might kick it out still. And so certainly, to be fair, you have to have notice and an opportunity to be heard. But if you look at the rules of court that talk about what happens in court and how these things take place, how lawsuits take place, how legal proceedings take place, the rules are very much premised on trying to create a fair procedure for both parties, for both sides. And so there's rules about sharing evidence and being able to get evidence from the other party, rules that set deadlines, but also make it so the case keeps moving along. Because without deadlines, then one side could just be stuck in endless litigation. And so deadlines are meant to be long enough to produce a response, but also short enough in the interest of justice to keep things moving forward. And then the courts have certainly tried to balance this and make this fair. But over the years, as litigation's grown, cases tend to get longer and longer. The rules stretch out some. Parties, it's not always just the rules. Parties will agree to extend things, make the cases go longer because their attorneys need more time. Different things like that will take place. And so when I look at due process and the balance, I think one of the real interesting things to look at is just to get an idea of the sheer number and magnitude of what we're talking about. How many lawsuits take place in America each year? How many laws exist in America? What are we talking about us as American citizens having to know to be a part of in the system? And so, Michael, curious if you have any answers or thoughts on some of those questions.
Yeah, there's a couple. The answers are sometimes hard to come by with this kind of stuff. The numbers are all over the place. Everybody kind of has their own idea of what they're looking for. If you just consider laws, you want to know how many laws are on the books in the United States of America, or even how many laws are in any given state. You won't be able to really find an answer. I found this quote on a website talking about how many federal laws there are. And this from an individual who I guess works at a reference desk at the Law Library of Congress. And they said we are frequently asked to estimate the number of federal laws in force. However, trying to tally this number is nearly impossible. And that's kind of describes the hopelessness of the situation. The U.S. government doesn't feel like it can tell us how many laws there actually are in the books. And so can we figure out what that number is? I don't know. It would take a whole lot of research and haven't been able to really find a good source. We can dive into maybe how long, as kind of like a small example, how long the federal tax code is. And again, opinions really divide on this one. Just talking in pages, people want to estimate somewhere between 9,000 to 70,000 pages. That generally comes because people can't really define what a law is. They say there's laws, and then there's regulations, and then there's case law. And so if you're just looking at standard law via Congress, maybe they're looking at some 9,000 pages. If you add all the regulation and the case law, maybe it comes somewhere around 70,000 pages. Either way, we're talking, at 9,000 pages, you're talking over 1 million words. This is if it was a series of books, it'd be longer than the Harry Potter series, just in tax code law established by Congress. You add all the regulations established by the IRS to implement that law, obviously it just expands incredibly from there on. If you want to look at law as in, well, how often are people breaking the law, or how often are lawsuits brought, maybe that could kind of describe how immense the frame of law is. And again, estimates on that are kind of all over the place as well. There's different estimates depending on if you're just looking at criminal law versus if you want to include civil law in those numbers and lawsuits. But if you're just looking at lawsuits filed, it's somewhere in the realm of 40 million lawsuits every year in the United States. If you want to include all cases brought to court, it's somewhere around 100 million cases brought to court each year in the United States. That's at the state level, I believe. The federal level, it's in the hundreds of thousands of cases brought to the federal courts each year. And so again, can we estimate it? I don't know. It's immense. The number's huge. How many laws do we have? The federal government doesn't know. How do we know if we're breaking a law? I guess if you run across a lawyer who knows that that's a law, then they can bring you to task over it. Then it can be looked up and can be found. But there's so many, we can't quite enumerate them. That's it's hard to figure out if we can define all the laws, just lay them out. It seems that it takes an army of people to know what all the laws are, and you can't get it all together to figure out how many there actually are in place.
Yeah, it's been real interesting. If any of you ever Google the number of laws in existence in the U.S., it's crazy the range that people put out, and there's no real agreement on it. From what we can tell, no one's taken the time to go through and count them all. And not even the government itself. But certainly you can start to just explore the code and the provisions and just see the sheer number of laws in existence. They talk about at the federal level, a number of places claim that there's over 5,000 reasons you could be arrested and put in jail. And that's what they say is directly written in statute. Some people then argue, well, there's an additional, they put on numbers like 10 to 90,000 reasons why you might end up being criminally liable based on regulations. Now, again, all those are made up because no one's counted 10,000 times or 90,000 times for these things. But they're highlighting this bigger principle that law is growing enormously large in America. I did look at one graphic that showed just the number of federal regulations back from 1994 to 2020. It's grown incredibly in just that amount of time.
And one other thing to describe the growth, it's not just that there's so many laws, but it's how often do they change or are added to. And there was an institution that tried to manage this from 2001 to 2012, and they just followed the tax code. And they noted that the tax code changed some 4,680 times from 2001 to 2012. If you put that out to changes per day, that's about one change per day. So it's not just that there's so many, they're also changing at quite the alarming rate. So just when you get to know how many there are, there's more added, or some are repealed, or some are changed. It's how do you track that when they change? Not only there's so many, but they change that fast.
Yeah, that's a great point, because if you look at some of the charts of the number of laws, some years the number of laws supposedly drops. And in those, what's happened is a chunk of code was repealed for some reason, or some regulations were repealed by a president, or some of those fun things that happen as different parties come into power. But again, it's this fascinating concept to say, okay, if you had to go, let's just say you were going to do a simple business. You wanted to sell, something like rice cakes you made at home. You wanted to sell them online and ship them across America. You just wanted your little store set up, online store, ship rice cakes. If you were to go to an attorney and say, okay, I'd like you to tell me every law I have to comply with, I don't know of any attorney that would answer that question for you. Because there'd be so many levels of law that they would say, okay, well, you need to talk to this specialist, you need to talk to this person, this person, this person. You know, you'd have to have a city business license, probably. You'd have to have a sales tax license to do sales tax compliance, not just in your jurisdiction, but across the whole United States. Across the whole United States, if you're shipping goods, it's estimated, there's over 14,000 sales tax jurisdictions in the US, meaning places with a potentially different rate of sales tax that you have to collect. And you have to somehow be able to track that file in the appropriate jurisdictions for the amounts you shipped there. And those are just two basic things off the get-go, off just getting started. And you then have to talk about, well, is our food product meet all the requirements and regulations associated with food products and edibles? Is it labeled correctly? Are we advertising correctly? Are we taking consumer data in the correct format? Are we processing it legally? Do we have our terms of use and our privacy policies in place? Have we respected all the privacy of people according to all the laws in existence in all the 50 states and federal government? And pretty quickly, a business owner can be pretty overwhelmed, or they can choose to say, you know what, I just hope it works out. And many people just say, I just hope it works out, because how can you pay all the different attorneys necessary to get advice on things? It's incredibly expensive. And even then, there's so many variations and subsets just to get advice. If you're trying to do a business where you ship to 50 states and you need compliance advice in those 50 states, that's very difficult to achieve. Unless you're a very large organization that has pretty significant amount of attorneys involved. And so the reason we bring that up is because as we look at this scale between anarchy and tyranny, one of the reasons that we get so many laws in place, so many details, is actually because of one of the ways that due process is being applied in the United States, where it's kind of creating its own vicious cycle. And that is that the law says you have to have notice of what you've been accused of. But as part of that, they're saying the law has to give you notice. And so in the tax code, for example, if they say, hey, we're going to tax you on 20% of your taxable income, and then they don't spell out in detail every single possibility for what taxable income is or isn't, then someone could go and say, oh, I don't have notice that this is considered income. And then they argue on due process grounds and say, this law didn't give me enough notice, it's too vague, it's too whatever. And the courts say, yeah, that law's too vague, it didn't give you full notice, so the lawmakers have to spell it out in more detail, and more detail, and more detail. And then we get to this place where now we have so many laws that there's no attorney that's read all the laws, there's no judge that's read all the laws, there's no person on this planet, to our knowledge, that's read all the laws, because there's so many pages of law, so many cases, so many things interpreting the law, striking down the law, doing different things with it, that who knows fully what it is. It's kind of a beast in and of itself. And that makes me ask the question of, that alone, can you have due process in a system where you have no clue what it really says? And to be fair, you have no way of finding out everything and what it says. And how do you have due process in a system like that? Currently, America just says, well, as long as we publish the law online and you can find it somewhere, or not even online, as long as we publish it in a book or something and you can find it, then you've got notice of it. You're deemed to have notice in America of every law ever written by the legislature. And most of us sit here and go, oh, I'm fine. I'm a good person. That's not illegal. But quickly, we start to learn that, well, the law is not just about regulating good and bad. The law is establishing procedures. The law is establishing rights of different people, versus others. If you're a business owner, do you have to include certain things in your contract? If someone emails you, what can you do with their email? Can you share it? Can you not? Just can I provide friends' emails to a company? We do that all the time, where we get a new app on our phone and it says, give it permission to look at your contacts list. Oh, sure. And suddenly we've just shared all our friends' data with this company. I can't say all of them. So we've shared all of our friends, their data that we have with the companies. And so could a state pass the law and say, hey, that's not appropriate, you can't do that? They could. And suddenly we're in a place of potentially violating a law. If we sell something and don't collect sales tax, if we hold a garage sale, many places say if you hold a garage sale 3 times in a year, you need to get a business license, you need to collect sales tax, you need to do a lot of things like that. One of the reasons, at least in Utah, that we have free vacuums at car washes is that car washes don't have to charge sales tax if they don't charge for their vacuums. If they charge for vacuums, then they have to charge sales tax. And so you drive around Utah and it's free vacuums at all the car washes because they don't want to charge sales tax. And for whatever reason, it's some silly law, has nothing to do with morality. It just is something. And you wouldn't have an idea just looking at it. And so I've often wondered and reflected on, at what point does the government have an obligation to inform us of things, to give us a heads up, to say, hey, we've got some new laws out that you should know about. You can no longer, states are, for example, banning gas-powered lawnmowers, gas-powered blowers. Is that fair? Is that appropriate? If you're now caught with a gas-powered blower because you had one and were using it, what happens at that point? And do they have an obligation to send you a letter in the mail, to do something? Now, again, if they did, there'd be an incredible number of mail you're getting. You'd get so much of it that you'd stop reading it, you'd stop looking at it, because there's so many laws being passed, so many things happening that people can't keep up with at all. And it does beg the question, why do we need so many laws? Why are we still passing so many laws? But in this due process realm, I think that part of it is because due process has been interpreted to say the law has to inform you of enough detail to say what is or isn't illegal. And so if law doesn't, if it's not clear enough, people may get around it being enforced against them. And then we have this thing of this desire to kind of stop all harm, stop all bad people, and we try to fill it in with more law, more law, more law. We criminalize more and more things. It's kind of like, if you look at the Utah Criminal Code, it's criminal conduct to point a laser pointer at a police officer, to shine it in their eyes. Now, understandably, it's a bad thing if you're trying to blind police officers with laser pointers and things. But it goes back to this question of, do we have to be that specific in the law? Or is it appropriate to say, if you choose to obstruct the operation of a police officer, it can be a crime? Because if we could say that, we could keep a ton of laws off the books. You could just know, oh, I can't obstruct a police officer in their duties, and let that play out, kind of case by case, court by court. And that's how the law used to be. The law used to be a lot more principled in nature, and we have what's called common law, where the judges would interpret it on a case by case basis. and see, yeah, it may apply to laser pointers if you can't obstruct the police, but that doesn't apply if you're stuck in traffic and there's just a ton of cars and you can't do anything about it. You're not going to be held criminally liable for that. But instead of this reliance on case law and the morality of judges, we're losing faith in that, and we spell it out. We spell it out and spell it out. And then America, I think, suffers under the weight of incredible amounts of law and a lot taking place there. And so I just put that out as I do feel there has to be some balance between the amount of law we have and due process. I don't feel that we can have full due process in a system where there's so many laws that even the government doesn't know how many there are. And I also believe very strongly that you should not have to pay an attorney to be able to tell you what laws apply to your situation. I believe very strongly that the government should have the obligation to tell you what laws apply to your situation. So I can go and say, hey, I'm starting a business, government over corporations or business, whatever you want to be. You need to tell me what laws I have to comply with instead of putting the burden solely on us to go through these things.
I think that's a really good point, because we talk about the burden being on the government to inform us of a law. And can you make the argument that if there are more laws than you can read through the amount of time before they change, they aren't really informing you of what the law is? It's humanly impossible to be informed at that point in time. And so can they state that they're following due process if a person can't really be informed of a law? By the time I read all of them, they've all changed, or some of them to some degree. If I have to spend my whole life reading law, and I can't act. And if I then have to rely on somebody else or an army of other people to read the law, and am I really informed about the law, or am I now forced to lose some modicum of freedom or independence? I have to rely on somebody else to read it, another army of people to read it. How informed am I at that point? I think there's an argument to be made that we're not really informed. We can't be informed of laws. It gets that detailed and that technical. And so you can say I published it, but that's like saying, here's a petabyte of data, go read it. You're informed now. It's kind of a tough case to make, I think.
Yeah, and it is one, certainly I don't think the courts could ever say that due process is violated by the sheer number of laws in place, because then every single person would be able to get out of enforcement of any law. That holding would fundamentally undermine all of America and its ability to enforce any law. But I think in looking at it, it's still a critical point, and I believe it's incumbent on us as the people to start to demand that the government actually, as part of due process and the procedure, say, government, we're going to demand that you be able to tell us what we have to comply with. You tell me. If I want to start a business, tell me what I have to do. Because then if we can say, oh, there's 50 things to start a business, well, now we can go see them all in one place, go lobby for or against them, get things to this more appropriate balance. But right now it's just, good luck. That's all the government tells you. Library of Congress, the catalog is everything. Hey, how many laws are there? Yeah, we get asked that question a lot. We don't know. And I go, that to me is a failure of the legislative and executive branch. And I believe very strongly that American citizens need the ability to go and say, okay, government, if you're going to regulate my conduct, you have an affirmative duty to tell me what you're regulating, and not just throw it out there in the midst of 1 million and 10 million and 50 million words. Tell me what you're regulating. You tell me in a very succinct way what I have to do. And I think that a lot of government would streamline if it were forced to do that. I really do, because they wouldn't want the burden of it. And it would create this very fascinating balance in the government where if the executive branch had to go through and catalog for everybody how they, what was required to comply with the law, they might veto a lot more laws right now and just say, way too much work for us, vetoed, way too much work for us, vetoed. And it would be to me, a very fascinating check and balance to say, government, you have an affirmative duty to tell us as the people what we have to comply with. And it's one that I think we could push for at a legislative level to get that type of law passed, to get those types of rights put in place, as opposed to fighting for it in court where it would disrupt the whole system and get everyone off, essentially.
And I think the flip side of that is, as a people, we have to remember when the laws are very clear and succinct, perhaps there will be a few things that may seem unjust, in that the government can't solve every one of our problems. Too often, we're turning to the government to solve every problem, and we end up getting a more and more complex code, be it tax or something else. We need to remember that many of our, lots of problems as citizens need to be handled as citizens. We need to look to each other to see what we can do and not ask the government to take everything upon them. If we want them to be clear and succinct, we need to allow for generalization in the rules, which means that not every single, if you look at the tax code, we're not going to pull all the money we can get from every person and leave every penny we can get to every person that we desire. Maybe it'll be more generalized, more standardized. But to understand the balance there between how regulated are we looking to be? We're extremely regulated. We have no idea what we're being regulated on. We can't know everything. And not expecting the government to make everything good and make everything right. That's just not a reality we live in if we want to maintain laws that we can understand.
Yeah, that's a great point. And again, currently, as society really is looking to the government, like you say, to solve all the problems, the laws are exploding. It's becoming just huge amounts of laws. Where last legislative session, Utah passed a record number of laws. According to the news reports, the median amount of time they spent considering the laws in their legislative session was 10 minutes. Long bills, big things. Median amount of time they spent considering it was 10 minutes. And that's crazy, sad. To say, wait, you voted on something that there's a lot of these bills you can't even read in 10 minutes. You don't know what's in it. Someone tells you a big blurb of it, and that's it. And that's due process, where you as the lawmaker can't even tell me what laws you just passed. Again, to me, it's getting a lot bit on the wild side of whoa. So the lawmakers don't know what's being passed. The judges don't know all the laws that exist, but I have a duty as an American to know every single law, and I can be held responsible for every single law. To me, that's out of balance, and we need to bring some balance back to this to say, no, law is important, yes, but we have to balance it with real life, with reality, with all these other things. And so to me, this is an area where America does need some correction. I don't believe it's sustainable at all to continue on with the extreme amount of law that we have in place. Law simply cannot protect every person. Law cannot stop every bad thing from happening. Law cannot provide redress for every possible thing that goes wrong. And we have to have a balance. We have to strike this balance of the things we care about the most, the things that we're working to protect, the things that are necessary for law, but the things that should be left to people to solve on their own. And so this gets into an interesting conundrum that I find in America right now. And that is that we have, as part of due process, one of the due process cases from a while ago, the Supreme Court held that due process of law says that there is this right to contract. Now, this case was from almost 100 years ago. And so it's not there's other provisions in the Constitution that can be determined to create this right to contract. So don't walk away from this believing that due process guarantees a right to contract. But the reason it's there is because freedom of contract has been associated with due process in some precedents. But we have something that's taking place right now where when you get on YouTube or you go to Sam's Club and buy a hot dog, or you go to Microsoft and use Skype or something like that, you are agreeing to arbitrate any disputes you have between you and Microsoft or you and Sam's Club. Arbitration is a process where you don't appear in front of a judge. You appear in front of a private person that's going to pick the outcome of your case. Arbitration has no appellate rights. You can't appeal. And you don't get a jury in arbitration. You're not guaranteed a speedy trial. You're not guaranteed the right to counsel. All these different things are waived when you agree to arbitration. And so as a contractual private matter, two people have entered into this agreement, or a corporation, a person, say we agree to arbitrate, we're going to keep our disputes out of court. And the question naturally arises, should we be able to waive constitutional rights? So far, the courts have said, yep, between a private person and a private person, you can waive those rights. But then it becomes, well, so what if Google or Microsoft takes my data and just gives it to the government? But I agreed to arbitrate that dispute. Now, where are we at? Is that due process of law that my data was just dumped there and I didn't get to go through and approve or not approve, or maybe it was just in a terms of use update? Oh, guess what? You signed into your email again after we updated our terms and said that we could dump it there. There's a lot taking place like that. And when we look at the cases, if there's truly, some people claim there's 100 million cases filed each year, criminal and civil. That's wild. I think there's 360, 370 million Americans, somewhere around there. There's 1.2 something million attorneys in the United States right now, I think. And certainly there's a lot of people that file cases without an attorney involved. But that's a lot of cases. That's a lot of legal disputes taking place between people. Incredible number of reliance on the government at that point. Whether those are eviction cases, car accident cases, criminal cases, divorce cases, all kinds of things that are taking place. And do we really believe even that the law is being fully applied in all these situations? Or are most people settling, dropping out because they can't afford the litigation? They can't jump through all the hoops. They can't keep up with all that's required of them. And in my experience as an attorney, most people stop the lawsuit's end long before trial, long before an opportunity to be heard, because people simply can't afford it. And I look at that too and I say, we have all these rules about fairness, but they all ignore the cost to the individual. So yeah, you get time to get evidence, you get time to do all these things. But hey, it will cost you $50,000 or $100,000 to get in front of a judge. No big deal. We still have due process of law. And to me, it really starts to violate the fundamental premise of due process, this opportunity to be heard. If the law says, and again, this goes back to what we talk about some with public-private partnership. If the law requires you generally to make it to trial, if you have to hire an attorney to make it to trial, and it's going to cost you a lot of money, what incentive does an attorney have to change this whole system or this law, these laws, all the fair procedures, because they make a lot of money off of it? And Utah did a study of all the demands for pro bono cases, where people just need help, can't afford an attorney. And they said that if every licensed attorney in Utah worked on these matters, there would still be more need than there were even attorneys to fill it, because the need's so high of people that have legal issues or legal disputes and can't afford to pay an attorney. And to me, when we talk about due process, these are fundamental violations at a very core level that we're not addressing. If we have no access to the courts, if we have no access to justice, not because because I'm male or female or the color of my skin or whatever, but because justice may be blindfolded but holding out her hand saying, well, can you pay? And maybe she's not the one asking for money, but before you even get to her, there's a lawyer sitting there holding out his hand saying, well, can you pay? Too bad for you. You're not one of the privileged ones. And that is alleviated some with criminal trials because the Constitution guarantees criminal defendants the right to an attorney. But even those people get generally overworked criminal defense lawyers, and they don't get often a fair shake at things. And so we have licensing laws that limit who can represent us in court. We have all these different pieces because we say, oh, the law is so complex. You need to make sure that your person has enough education to adequately represent you in court. Well, doesn't that alone mean there's a problem? Mean that we're probably out of balance so again, I have an obligation to know every law as an American. I can be charged with violating every law because they say I have knowledge of it. But you won't let someone represent me in court unless they've spent years in school because of how complex the laws are. And I look at that and go, isn't that a fundamental conflict? Aren't we as a nation really departing from this notion of justice and equality where we say, yeah, come into court and talk about it? But very few people dare to because the law is so complex. We're trying to address so many issues. And so due process to me is a very important thing, in that due process to me is meant to say the government has to follow its own rules. It can't pick and choose who it attacks, in what manner. It's got to be fair. So if you come into court, you get the same procedures, whether you're accused of murder, whether you're accused of tax evasion, no matter the color of your skin. And I think it's a very important check. But I think it's a check that's being overlooked as our laws run rampant. And we have to come back to this place of saying there needs to be a balance. And what do we do about that balance? And how do we get there? And to me, one of the fundamental ways to start that balance back would be to require the government to be able to tell us what laws we have to comply with if we're going to do certain things. That will clean up so much law, so much excess, so much waste, because the government would say that's an impossible task. And if it's an impossible task for the government, it's an impossible task for us. And to me, the government should absolutely, if they're promulgating the laws, they need to tell me, hey, you need to do this, 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 and this in order to be legal. Here's the form. Here's, whatever it takes to comply. That needs to be freely available to people, in my opinion. Or else we don't have, at a fundamental level, true due process of law. And so we would certainly welcome anyone that wants to push on that or talk about that if you are interested in pushing that in one of your state legislatures. We'd love to be a part of that. We'd love to help draft ideas, look at ways to get that type of thing through, because we do need some fundamental checks like this to ensure that law and reality are always connected. If law gets so disconnected from reality, there is no liberty, there is no freedom. And our government has to follow its own rules, but I think that it should also have to share the burden of compliance that comes with all the rules it passes. So Mike, I don't know if you have any final thoughts or anything today with due process and the things we've talked about here.
Just along the same lines, it's the temptation is, you see it across the country, left, right, and center. Hey, something's wrong. Let's go get a law passed. Let's go fix it. And I also think left, right, and center, nobody is satisfied with what we have. And it seems the solution is, hey, we need another law, more complex, more defined. We didn't catch this one piece that this guy's getting away with. Let's make sure we redefine the law so we catch this guy next time. Oh, wait, there's another guy who did something just a little bit different. Let's go catch him too. And to your point, why don't we start with, can we actually understand what we're being asked to do? We look at the sheer volume of laws. We look at how frequently they change. How about just the complexity of each law? I know I've read through many laws that have been passed. I read through it. I read it a few times, and I go, "Do I even know what this is actually telling me to do?" And there's a wide variety in America of individuals, and the large difference of understandings and abilities. Are we saying that only the very smartest people can understand the law, and then all the people that maybe don't comprehend as well, but they have, qualities in other ways, have to just rely on these individuals to tell them what the law is? There's so many different aspects to this, to the complexity, to the size, how frequently it changes. And it feels like like you said, we've gone astray. We've pursued every bit of injustice that we can find, only to find there's more injustice out there. And we need to pull back a little bit and say, how can we do justice to every American to make sure we can understand what's being asked of us? Because as we're pursuing every little injustice for every person we can find, we're promulgating a huge injustice to all Americans, just not being able to understand what they're being asked to do.
Yep, and that's a great way to summarize it. The more we focus on ridding the world of injustice, the more we create a massive injustice. And this, from our perspective, is what leads to tyranny, when we expect the law to solve everything. And the law never will. The law is incapable of stopping harm. And we see that. Even if you look at the number of laws in existence, some people claim, again, this is based on your definition of laws, a number of places claim there's 20,000 gun laws throughout the US. Have they stopped gun violence? Have they stopped all these issues? No. Does that mean that there's no law that could help? No, it doesn't mean that either. There could be a law that could reduce gun violence, for sure. But it's to be able to look at it and say, law's purpose isn't to stop harm. It can't be, because the law is incapable of that unless we are controlling every aspect of every human. We have to tolerate harm because we live with humans, we live with people. Now, does that mean that if someone shoots someone else, we just have to say, oh, nothing we can do about it? No. We can have laws against murder. We can have laws that take people and put them in jail. But if the goal of the law is to stop someone from ever being murdered, that's an impossibility. It will never happen. Because, okay, let's ban guns. Well, there's knives. Well, let's ban knives. Well, what are we going to make our food with? Well, there's still clubs. Well, there's still pieces of wood. There's rocks. Nature provides tools to kill people. Now, again, are they as effective as a gun? No, I'm not pretending that they are. It's just to say that law has no power to stop that from happening at a large level. But if we pursue ridding the world of injustice through law, we will create a massive injustice. And I really like how I said that. And to me, we can see that with this due process notion. The more we say that, oh, you got to detail it out for everyone and describe it, the more oppressive our laws become. We're not ridding the world of injustice. We're creating more injustice. It's not this balance of liberty. Americans don't thrive in a heavily regulated state. Businesses don't thrive. Attorneys thrive. They make a lot of money. Do they have an incentive to change it? No. Do the people that hold power have an incentive to change it? No. Which means that we as a people have to step up and say, we're going to start to demand some things of you. We want some changes because this is wrong. it shouldn't cost me $50,000 to $100,000 to take a case to trial. That's ridiculous. It shouldn't require that I consult with dozens of attorneys just to know what I need to do to sell rice cakes. That's crazy. We need to have better balance in our country. And I do believe very much that as people, we could start trends and solutions. We could get things in place, even though the powers that be don't necessarily want it. There are many ways for us as people to act as a check on them and to get these things through. And I think it's well worth our time and effort because amount of law alone, or else we won't exist in a state of liberty because the law will be regulating everything we do, say, see, touch. And that's not a great state for us to be in. So we certainly appreciate you being with us today. Again, reach out if you're interested in actually pursuing any of these solutions. We'd love to work with you. We do work with people who and strategize with them on getting some solutions through to better check and balance things. And this is one that we find quite interesting. Next week, we're going to talk a little bit more about some due process elements and what a specific application of it with eminent domain and the government's ability to take your property. There's some interesting, again, public-private partnership issues that come up with eminent domain. And so we'll look forward to talking more about that then, and appreciate you and hope you have a great week.